We can start. Right, I think we should get started. Right, our next summit from Landlink. Everybody knows Paul Turner. Tēnā koe. What's with the beard now? Oh, is that what it is?
Yes, it's coming off tonight. Can we just clarify that's not...
Hey, are you doing both? There are two slots.
Yes, I'd like to do both. Perhaps we can stop after the first section and take some questions.
Okay, cool. Off you go.
Yes, you're right. My beard is coming off tonight. Not my vote, my wife. She's the one who's made that choice. So my name is Paul Turner. I'm a land development consultant based in Waikanae. One of my colleagues, Marie Payne, is joining us as well. She's a senior planner. I hear that the parole board make their most lenient decisions at just after morning tea and just after lunch, and they make their harshest decisions at, what's the time now? At about 3:15. So please bear that one in mind.
Yes.
So Landlink is here representing submissions we made as a business. We're representing some of our clients, and I think we're also representing the community when we talk about some of the wider perspective that is important to Kāpiti. We've got a few slides of the messages, key messages that we'd like to pass on. Certainly we understand that it's been a long journey with the growth strategy. You've got a lot of pressure with national policy statements and various bills that are impacting on your decision making. However, we're excited about the growth that Kāpiti is looking forward to. We want to make sure that it's the right sort of growth. We have a lot of expertise, obviously, over the last many years, decades, in fact, of working for our community. And I think it's important that we demonstrate that Landlink is an advocate for council, that we need to work together to get the right growth that we're talking about. Essentially, we will be the ones who will be putting into action some of the growth that's been talked about. The growth, we believe, your role, council's role, is where, when and how the growth should occur. Not necessarily who or what form it might take. Certainly the who can change over time. I've been a consultant in the district for a long time, but my clients change a lot. They move on from one project to another. I think one of the key subtleties here is that the national policy statement and council's approach looks to plan for better growth. We're suggesting that council need to plan better for growth. That is, provide the tools, infrastructure and planning tools that are important to help the right growth occur. We think that the strategic focus should be on providing well-functioning infrastructure and processes and not necessarily directing land use. We've seen in the last couple of months that the government can change those directives quite quickly, and the message with COVID, for example, is also a constantly changing element of land development over time. Infrastructure is the key for growth. stormwater management, sewer, water and roading. Clearly, council need to partner with developers and the government, if possible, to help deliver that infrastructure. You can't provide houses till you've got the infrastructure and roading to service them. No doubt there'll need to be a rethink of the long-term plan to consider the changes that have been forced on council to make sure that the funding is in the right place. Key message is to allow for the low-hanging greenfield fruit to be rezoned promptly. There are a number of areas, surplus expressway land, logical extensions to urban areas, and probably some robust private plan changes that will be coming through the process. They are what I'd regard as low-hanging fruit. I've been working with Hamish and Jason and the rest of the team for some time on a number of elements of the growth strategy, and I'd encourage that relationship to continue. I think if we considered what the key risks are for development, this is the order they should be. It's a planning and framework risk. From a developer's perspective, that's a key consideration. If we have confidence about the outcome in terms of zoning, then we can have confidence with the rest of the process. Having landowners on board, obviously if you've got large projects with single landowners, then that makes the process easier. And the last 4 items, stormwater, sewer, water and roading, are italicised because they're technical constraints that we need to work within, but they're not deal breakers in terms of high risk elements for developers. The next part of the presentation was around individual site assessments, but I wondered if you wanted to ask some questions at this point.
Paul, can I start by asking you, you said, rewrite the long-term plan for funding of key infrastructure. What's your view in terms of what's starting to shape the three waters and the alienation of that to aggregated, amalgamated body, which would be much more of a distance from the engagement that you've already traditionally developed with local authority like KCDC?
Yes, it's a complex area that I'm glad that I'm not deeply involved in. That's going to be your area of expertise to shape the national discussion around three waters. However, I think that the key infrastructure that we face, infrastructure issues, are around sewerage. All of the work that council have done over the last decade or so in regard water has got us in a good place. There's a lot of infrastructure around roading, which is positive improvements. I think sewerage is the key. We've got a capacity constraint in that area and no clear solution to long-term growth.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor McCann, or Councillor Coates.
Kia ora, Paul. Thank you for coming in and speaking to your submission. Actually, also some really good points in the slides there too, which I've noted down. So thanks for bringing that to the table. You'd mentioned a number of clients that you've had go through your business over your practicing years. We often hear about the dirty developers and so forth. With the ones that you're working with at the moment and looking at the proposals within Kāpiti over the next 10 years or so, what's their when they're coming to you, what's their desire, intention around growing well, around doing good developments? And then how does that marry in with, I guess, council's plans and so forth?
Yes, I suppose I wouldn't necessarily call them dirty developers, but perhaps their focus is potentially shorter term than ours. When I say ours, I'm talking about the community council and the consultants. And often they are preparing land for sale, not going on and building houses. In fact, that's predominantly the case. So we find that they're not necessarily looking at the built form and the outcomes that the community might be focusing on. So how do we incentivize the right outcomes? I don't have the answer to that, but we as a business look at our projects in a holistic way. We're trying to be consider the future for the community. If you walked into our office, you'd see a plan from 1892, I think it is, and the lines that are on the plan are still there today. They represent the heritage of the land development over the years. And when I look at the projects that we've been involved in, largely, not wholly, but largely, I'm proud of what we've done. And I think that's a legacy that a business like ours needs to hold close, and of course council do as well. I'm not answering the question about what our clients might think, because that can vary. But at the moment, we're constantly examining the right approaches. You've got 6 growth priorities, and we think they're just as important for our business as well.
Thank you. And I guess that's what I was trying to understand, was between the advice that you provide to your client and their desire to develop a property, whether it be a developer or a couple looking at doing a development and building, is whether there is some correlation between good outcomes, looking after the land and so forth, as opposed to let's just chop this up and do it, fast and nasty. So what I'm hearing from you is there's generally a willingness to try and do that right?
Yes. The larger developers will move on to another project, and they have a legacy that they want to continue on, but people will come in and buy the outcome from them. So it's important they do it right as well.
Councillor McCann.
Thanks, Paul, for coming here. Just got a couple of questions, and forgive me if I've got it wrong. You mentioned where, when, and how, but we shouldn't be talking about, we shouldn't be directing the who. Has council ever done that? So what? Because I'm not long enough around the tooth area as a councillor to know what you're referring to.
No, you're right. I guess it's important that we understand the roles in the process, and no, it hasn't been who. You're right. It's correct.
One of the other questions I've got was you mentioned that it would be useful for us to provide planning tools. What do you mean by that?
If we looked at the 8 objectives of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, they have a considerable number of references to planning processes and planning tools. And that's plan changes, that's infrastructure processes. Infrastructure is mentioned in the NPSUD. So those are the tools that council are best at facilitating to get the right outcomes. The district plan team, the policy team, Jason and Hamish, they're the guys who are in the best position to be able to create the right tools to implement a growth strategy.
Right. The other area, and I'm interested in, and forgive this question, when you were presenting, you said the low-hanging fruit. Can I ask, is that low-hanging fruit with greenfields, is that representative of the type of client you have? Is that why you're pushing us in that, suggesting that we go in that direction?
I will talk to some of the projects that we have clients that have asked us to make submissions to the growth plan. Yes, but no. The no bit is that I guess as I've said, we're here to get the best outcome for the community, and making the best use of infrastructure which exists, and the surplus land, for example, along the expressway is a good example where infrastructure, roading and all the infrastructure already exists. Now, when I talk about some of the projects that we'll see shortly, I'm also indicating that I think there are a lot of examples where we can get growth relatively quickly with the infrastructure that we already have. I don't think that we should be relying on infill development through the intensification bill to provide the sort of outcome that we need, or the numbers that we need. So, yes, I'm advocating for growth in the right place. Don't sit back and wait for the intensification to occur to meet the requirements of the demand that we're seeing. We need to pick the low-hanging fruit to be able to advance some development. And it just seems so logical that we've had the expressway in place for, 3 years, 4 years, that we shouldn't be utilising that land on the fringes of the expressway.
So just to clarify, what I'm hearing is that you're suggesting that while some of what we're doing and what the government's doing is enabling potential development, that requires pick-up from developers and owners, whereas organisations such as yourself have clients that are ready to start building on green fields in a much more planned and organised and perhaps bigger numbers.
Yes, I'm aware of a number of large projects that are well funded, are well resourced in terms of expertise, and infrastructure is the key to see those implemented, because typically these larger areas tend to be a little further away from the infrastructure than these low-hanging fruit that I'm talking about.
Thanks very much.
Paul, you've been in the business now for 2 decades. In more recent times, we've had a raft of government legislation that's increasing the engagement of Maori or mana whenua in the development area. From a advisor, consultant to developers, you sit in quite an interesting position to be able to share your views in terms of how this has now come to a stage where, can you advise us how better council can facilitate this requirement and how this is understood by developers and the need for early consultation, who they consult in this whole area, which can be quite sensitive?
Yes, that's a tricky one. I think fundamentally we're all out for the same outcome, the iwi, the council, and largely the developers. The relationship with iwi is very important into the future. It's becoming more and more so. It's probably fair to say we don't get as close to that process as we should, being a group of consultants. Council would probably be closer than we are. So I'd encourage that process to continue. I'm not answering your question.
No, you're not.
Mr. Mayor.
I can see it's a difficult area.
Yeah.
But would it be useful for the consultant community, so to speak, to have by themselves a better relationship with the shapers of Te Ao Māori in the development area?
Absolutely.
Which council can facilitate?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely agree.
Thank you. Any other questions? No, you can go on to the next one.
Okay, so we've subtly changed the phraseology to plan better for growth from better planning for growth. I'd like to point to a number of sites that we're involved in particularly, and on which we have made submissions on, highlighted with the red arrows. They also represent some standard approaches, I think, in terms of low-hanging fruit. So starting from the north, the other element to it, you'll just see that two little red train stations have popped up there. I think that they are critical to the design decision-making for Kāpiti into the next 30 years. If they are going to happen, that will dramatically change the scope of a growth strategy. And you'll see that in some of the discussions that we've got coming up. You've had a presentation earlier today on Peka Farm, which is north of Waikanae. There's been a lot of work put into that project. Infrastructure can be provided. There are opportunities for extending infrastructure beyond the site. I think it's the fifth growth priority that you have is embracing opportunities. Well, this is potentially one of them. There's also a bunch of former NZTA land adjoining this site, which is another opportunity. Essentially, this is a study area, and the study has been done for you. Out towards the beach, we've got a growth area to the south, just north of Rutherford Drive on Paitaura Road. It makes sense that intensification also go north, adjoining the infrastructure. The sewer pump station is in that location. There's an east-west notional road on the current district plan. That's a strategic link. So it just makes logical sense to develop both sides of the existing and proposed infrastructure. Hadfield Road, you can see a train station there as well, or potential train station. That's a logical extension north as well. The Peka interchange represents another opportunity, a four-way instead of two-way. I think, once again, that would dramatically change the growth strategy. That particular area is the third-ranked study area in terms of yield. We support the analysis of where it currently sits. I think it's priority 2B because the infrastructure isn't in that location just yet. At the northern urban edge of Waikanae, there's some future urban development land. There, I've pointed out that there's some boundary discrepancies in that place, but in that location. But essentially, infrastructure is there. So a trunk main runs through this particular site. We support the analysis in that location. Waikanae Beach, this is the Te Moana interchange. I guess one of the things that we noticed during looking at the reporting on the Greenfield assessment was that our knowledge of the sites resulted in the fact that we know that stormwater, for example, in this particular site isn't as dramatic as it might seem from the analysis. And similarly, the relationship with landowners is very important here. So that's low-hanging fruit. Infrastructure is all there. There's actually also an opportunity to extend a sewer rising main to make a connection from the Raupraha Street pump station through to the standby main, which is on the expressway. So that's a relationship that should be explored with the landowners there. I think that this should be priority 1. Similarly, the land on the other side of the road, all infrastructure, roading infrastructure is available. Yes, there are constraints, but there are constraints anyway. Nikau Valley Tini Village is a project that has the single largest one-owner growth area. It's potentially right opposite a new rail station, which changes the yield significantly. The only infrastructure which is not available there is the sewer, which is just over a kilometre away to the standby main. There are opportunities here for quite a variety of housing opportunities, from intensification near rail station. Of course, there's the Oturua Park across the other side of the road of the main trunk line. There's lifestyle opportunities, there's regenerative design as well. Here's a little bit more detail on that. We're also mindful of the open space strategy connections which are possible here. Oturua Park, which is a regional sports centre, that's a fantastic opportunity to get some intensification. And you'll see in red I've highlighted, I'm not sure why council shouldn't be considering undertaking some housing in this location as well. The Lindale Centre, we're working for a client there who has some complexities with resource consenting due to the zoning, which is a gateway precinct, not a true mixed use zone, and it's low-hanging fruit. It should be priority 1 as well. All the services are already existing. In Ramadi Beach, a client has an interest in priority 1 land here. We support this analysis. Once again, this is low-hanging fruit. All the services are at the door. So those growth principles that we talked about, embracing the opportunities, I think involves including private plan changes. How can council facilitate using the ISPP process potentially to help deliver on growth? So the messages here are playing to your strengths, and that infrastructure is a key requirement for growth. Thank you.
Right, questions. Councillor Goods.
Paul, I'm interested in your comments just there around the Lindale, and look, I'm not an expert on our district plan, but Gateway Precinct, is that referring to the original State Highway 1 corridor being the gateway into Palapurumu or something different?
I think it was essentially based on the fact that the existing shopping precinct was primarily a mixed-use zone, but the zoning doesn't really facilitate residential development. We've got about 40 or 50 residential units being planned in there, but the zoning isn't really helping us at all.
So I totally got that, but is the term Gateway Precinct referring to the connection with the State Highway, which is clearly no longer our State Highway, that is a gateway?
Yeah, that sounds logical, yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, that's right, I'll follow that up with staff offline.
Right, anybody else with questions? Nope. Thank you, Paul, for taking the time to talk to us. It's very interesting stuff.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Excuse me, Mr. Mayor, can I ask if it's possible
Yeah, Martin.
presentation, if it's possible to get a
Paul.
copy of that at all?
Paul.
Sure.
Just wondering if it's possible to get a copy of the presentation that
Yes,
you just did there, would be
absolutely.
much appreciated.
Have you got a copy in the... of it? Yep. Okay.
Cool.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you.
Right, that was good.
Should have you going straight.
Yeah, let's have another round. Yeah. Right, next submitter number 50, Murray Smith and Chris Simpson. Tēnā koe. The Templeton Kāpiti Limited.
Good afternoon. I won't go through the formal introduction. I assume that you all know me. And I won't take up too much of your time either, so I'll leave it more open to questions. Unfortunately, my Auckland colleagues can't make it because they're still in lockdown, so you get the B team. Apologies in advance for that. Obviously, a little bit about us. We're an $8 billion business. We're doing quite a lot of development currently around New Zealand. We purchased Todd Properties, the majority of Todd Properties, about 2 years ago now, so we've owned the airport now for that couple of years. And in that couple of years, we've been doing a lot of due diligence, a lot of research. We've already shared with you one of our large documents that has shown all that research to date, and carry on as such. Compliments to the team putting this document together. I think if you were to stand back, and I am old enough to remember the Town and Country Planning Act, and I was actually in Parliament in 1991 as a researcher when the new Resource Management Act was put into place, that the new document in the sense of the Te Tupu Pai Growing Well initiative is starting to recognise the sophistication of development these days, of what's actually really needed. It's not just build up to the boundaries and hope they come, but it's actually very much about making sure that the environment is recognised and protected, communities are understood, and more importantly, that we understand what quality development is for dealing with our community. So that's been a 30-year process, and this document sort of reflects that. From our own perspective, at a Kāpiti Airport perspective, we're still going through a process, understanding with regards to what is an operational airport over, what is the opportunity cost of if the airport was to close, and that's part of what we want to discuss in our submission. We've identified that, well, as identified in the Growing Well initiative on pages 38 and 39, that you've identified the high priority greenfield growth areas around parts of the airport, about 15 hectares, I think. What we're sort of discussing is if the airport was to close, what would happen with the other 95 hectares of land, and how do you actually contain that within this document itself? I think in summation, as seen in our submission here, the requested amendment that we have is a very simple one, that you carry on with Palapurumu land appropriately located adjacent to an operating airport is fine, but also insert plus the land containing the airport if the airport closes, because that allows enough opportunity to have those conversations, rather than just saying if it's not going to be an airport, it's not going to be anything, and it leaves it open for dialogue, and that's what we find is very, very important to be having. So thank you for the opportunity to present. As I said, I don't want to take up too much time, but happy to take questions.
Right, any questions? Councillor Compton.
Thank you, and thank you for your submission, Chris. I almost thought we had the new National Party leader walking in there for a second. It seems to be the look at the moment.
Yeah.
But my question was about, it sort of relates to something we heard in an earlier submission. I can't think of who it was, but it was concerns around, I guess, traffic volumes if any development goes on the airport. So how would that get mitigated, even if you're just talking about 16 hectares of it being developed for residential, or something like Kāpiti Urban was talking about 2,000 houses on it? How do you sort of mitigate those effects? Yeah,
that's where our traffic, thanks, good question. That's where our traffic engineers will be working with council and also regional council to mitigate that, but also how do you make it relevant to public transport itself and what those linkages are. When you're doing, if the airport was to close, when you're doing a development of scale, all of that is definitely factored into, which is why when I discussed earlier on about how we've moved on from the RMA and being a lot more focused on what a community is and how to move people around, that stuff isn't rushed. It's taken its time. And again, if the airport was to close and we were to get into a discussion around plan change, then that will be open to a community discussion as well, which is why having it open with the amendment allows everyone to have that opportunity to have those conversations here and now. So, thanks.
Thank you.
But I'm happy to come back with a more fuller answer from our transport engineers if you'd like.
Councillor Hanford.
Yeah, kia ora, Chris.
Kia ora.
I've just got a question which relates to a specific sentence in your written submission.
Yes.
Where you say that the Templeton Kāpiti Limited fully supports KCDC's Te Tupu Pai. Without commenting in detail, Templeton has no doubt that the future use and development of the land can achieve the following essential elements of the Growing Well vision. So I'm just wondering if you could provide a little bit more detail, because I feel like we're yet to kind of see a groundbreaking, kind of really exciting vision, and I'm just wondering if you mention in here that there is, you have no doubt that whatever vision ends up being co-created will meet those kinds of principles and various points within the Grow Well document. Can you provide a bit more detail?
Yeah,
please?
and that was in that original document that we gave you with all the background with regards to the in-depth. As I said, we spent $2 million in research regarding the plans or the master planning that we're currently doing. That's what we'll run through with Hapu first before we bring it to council. We've always said that all along. Behind the scenes, we're working with very reputable architects and master planners as well. So doing a lot of work in and around that. So, yeah.
And is there kind of a time frame around that?
Not
stuff,
at the moment.
Cool.
The sooner COVID goes, the better.
Okay.
And all around New Zealand, from a development perspective, it's held us up, just purely because we can't get on site. So.
Any other questions, Councillor Compton?
I just thought I'd jump in with a second one. Just thinking about the Kāpiti Urban's submission earlier, where they were talking about the economic impact of the airport. So in a hypothetical situation, you'd be looking at some sort of, not just residential, you're looking at some sort of mixed use, commercial spaces in there as well. So
Yes.
there would be other business opportunities that come out of that as well.
Absolutely. We've said all along, it won't just be houses, it will be boutique retail, it will be, especially COVID's learned us all that people will want to be working from home. It's how you bring all of that thinking in, and especially around the areas around Kāpiti landings, right through to going north through to northwest to where the car yards are and where the Caltex service station is. So there's quite a lot of mixed use that will be in there, and it's something that we're cognizant of, that you need to have space for, not just housing.
Cool.
Councillor McCann.
Kia ora, good to see you again. I remember when you were all here in front of council, and I did put one very quick question to your leader.
And he said yes.
And he said yes.
Yes.
And just for the record, because this is being filmed and that wasn't,
Yeah.
that question was about foregoing some profit motive to ensure that there could be some social housing and some high density housing, perhaps. Because
Yeah,
we're
and
talking
the
about
answer to that remains yes.
and that is exactly what everyone wants to hear. Thank you very much.
That's okay. Thank you.
Right, any other questions? No? Thank you, Chris, for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. I'll just get back to running the National Party.
That's also been recorded, you realise that?
No, I meant that.
You did.
See you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Cheers. We've got one. Oh, we've got this. Guy Burns, is it?
We've called most people. It's just a matter of if they can come forward and bring them in.
Yeah.
We do have one submission that's tabled at the end, and I was just going to hand out the submission now. If you can approve that in with a couple of minutes. This is the last one of the day. This one was just because it came through the system late, so we've included it. But
This Anakata.
Yep, and we weren't able to include it in our package that went out to you earlier. So I was just going to table it now.
Yeah.
And then people can flick through it before the final speaker of the day. That's all right.
Cool. Can you just explain what's happening?
Yep. This is the submission that's the last of the day.
Anakata.
We received it after you'd already received the pack, so I'm just writing through now to get a chance to either it through before it comes in. So a few minutes earlier rather than taking it on the spot.
So, Tanika, we got Guy Burns, is it? Now?
Hi, Guy. Are you around? Yes.
Yep. Yeah, I'm here.
Awesome.
Yep, you're ready to go. Touch on the main
Yep.
points, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay. Yeah, I'll keep it pretty quickly. Greetings to everyone, and I acknowledge Trevor Daniel, who passed away. He was a great supporter of local democracy, and I'm sure he's keeping a keen eye on things right now. I'm talking on behalf of the Palapurumu Ramadi Community Board, and I'll keep it very brief. You've had a lot of words today. Basically, we think it's a good document, grow well, and the board supports growth and intensification, but we ask the council to tread carefully, also acknowledge the protection of existing open space rights and sunshine rights that residents have in Kāpiti. We have a unique environment of low-level housing, and to just bring in strategy at this time is a wise move to do, but we need to do it very carefully. The board supports some of the recommendations, but we do recognise that the introduction of intensification is an important part of the document, and it should be done in a very phased and considered manner. And we suggest that instead of introducing intensification up to 6 stories in the town centres of Kāpiti, that we start with the areas of the railway stations and the town centre, keep that at 6 stories, and then over time that can progress from there. Also, look at greenfield sites for areas of intensification. I know they're not mentioned, but they're better places in some ways because you're not impeding or imposing on existing residential properties that are there. You use a new development, and if it starts off fairly high, people can get used to it. It's not a big deal, and people are moving into a new environment. And just to finish off, we talked about wetlands. We also asked that wetlands be strongly protected, even former wetlands which have been drained, which are now being developed. I believe these should be looked at being carefully conserved for the future generations. And finally, developers must pay their fair share towards infrastructural costs. The board was very strong on that. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you. Rob McCann.
It's interesting to hear you say that perhaps we shouldn't be looking at some of the higher builds in certain areas, because the thing that we're doing here is we're looking out 30 odd years. And as someone else mentioned, some comments I've made, that actually, while we're enabling this to happen, we aren't forcing anyone to build it, and the market eventually will decide what's built. Personally, if you don't signal many years in advance, then we're never going to get there. So my question to you is, how do you actually signal that we are going to intensify in some areas unless we actually signal? Because what you're suggesting is that we don't signal that we're going to intensify in certain areas across the whole region.
Yeah, well, I think you can signal it by starting telling all the ratepayers that you'll start on some areas, and then you could introduce after a period of time that these areas will be considered. But you don't need to say now, well, all areas must be built up within 30 years. You can say some areas can be within 10 years, and after 10 years we can look at Otaki, Palapurumu Beach and Ramadi Beach, something like that.
Yeah, so you're looking at some type of phased approach, and we'd have to...
Yes, that's the key word, phased.
The problem, and I ask you, what's the solution for this? Because the phased approach often works when people are living in the area that they'd like to be phased later. But when we go to phase it in 10 years' time, there'll still be a new bunch of people who would like it to be phased in later. So you end up just kicking the can further and further down the road.
Oh, well, if it's all signalled well beforehand, and people are moving in later, well, they know that, well, in 10 years it's going to be phased in. I've got to be aware of that, or 5 years, or within whatever the time is. But as long as it's signalled and people are aware of it, they'll buy accordingly.
Thank you.
Right. No other questions, Guy Burns. Thank you very much
for
taking the time.
Thank you. Bye.
Rachel Barber, Low Carbon Kāpiti. Who's deputy? Oh, yeah. Oh, hey, lots of hay. Right. Rachel Barwell. Thank you. Low carbon Kāpiti.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for the opportunity to present on behalf of both the Kāpiti Climate Change Action Group and Low Carbon Kāpiti to Council's Te Tupu Pai Growing Well strategy. You will have all received our written submissions, so I won't rehash it here today, except to address the following key points. The strategy seems to take the highest population growth trajectory from Statistics New Zealand, some 30,000 extra residents in Kāpiti, and is that really realistic? Secondly, with the attendant increases in building and infrastructure activities due to growth, we must take a low carbon approach. The construction industry contributes up to 38% of global CO2 emissions, yet if developers were incentivised to use low-embodied carbon concrete, for example, together with appropriate recycling and reusing of materials, it could become a carbon net zero industry. Council need to accept upgrades to existing infrastructure such as sewage pipes and wastewater treatment plants will be required to allow for the inevitable densification. You can't put your heads in the sand and hope that developers' contributions will solve all of your infrastructure problems with greenfield developments, which we generally suggest is not the way forward. We need to ring fence and preserve our remaining valuable soils for local horticulture and agricultural food production. The days of fresh produce being shipped up and down the country in diesel trucks are numbered, and we need quality land to become more food secure in this district now and into the future. As part of our submission process, we hosted a Kāpiti Dialogue online event on November 8 to hear from two esteemed New Zealand-based experts in sustainable town planning, George Weeks, the principal urban designer at Kāinga Ora, and Kate Magnus, lecturer in the environmental planning program at the University of Waikato, who is also working with Hamilton City Council in re-envisaging Hamilton's built environment through a climate mitigation lens. My colleague Alison Lash will share key insights from that event which are applicable to Kāpiti's context in her presentation to follow. We applaud the authors of Te Tupu Pai draft strategy for including climate considerations in Council's forward planning, but it continues to baffle us as to why addressing climate mitigation, resilience and restoration is not the fundamental core underpinning context for such a growing well strategy. Surely, given the weight of scientific evidence and the realities we're experiencing with climate change effects, every single strategy and policy coming out of any government body, including this one, needs to have addressing climate change at its heart. Climate change is the biggest threat to the world in terms of our living well, and now and into the future. So I'm here to advocate for the many people in our community who either live in insecure housing that is and will continue to be impacted by flooding and groundwater level rises, who cannot find affordable housing near transport hubs, or who have to drive 30 plus kilometres round trip each day to catch a train to go to work, who can't afford quality food for their family because their rent takes the vast majority of their paychecks. I recently came across Janine Bennies, founder and CEO of the Biomimicry Institute at Arizona State University. She's a huge advocate of regenerative by design principles. And I'm sharing this because it could be a model that this council may adopt with this strategy. Janine's Generous Cities concept envisages cities that benchmark their urban designs against the health metrics of nearby ecosystems. For example, our ancient carbon sink and swamp at Queen Elizabeth Park, or the Tararua forests, or the oceans out on Kāpiti. These benchmarks are used to inspire planners and designers to create landscapes as wild as those beautiful places, where rooftops could grow food, gather the sun's energy and welcome wildlife. Pavements could store stormwater runoff and slowly release it into our aquifers. Buildings sequester CO2, cleanse the air, treat their own wastewater and turn sewage back into nutrients. All part of an interconnected web that is woven through with wildlife corridors and urban agriculture. The key design questions of the Generous Cities approach are: ask not what is my fair share to take, but rather ask what other benefits can we layer into this so that we can give some away. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to this.
Thank you very much. Can we have Alison Lash, then we'll ask questions for both.
Perfect.
Can you hear me with this mask on? Yeah, good. Okay, thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks for the opportunity to comment on this proposed growth strategy. From a climate change emergency response perspective, it's a great improvement on the EDS and the transport strategy that we hassled you about previously. Building on what Rachel just talked about, I want to focus specifically on the concept of 15-minute neighbourhoods, sometimes called 20-minute cities, or low-carbon neighbourhoods, or climate-friendly neighbourhoods. Is there anybody here who's not familiar with that concept? Excellent. So, has somebody got the button to push for the next slide, or can I do it? I can do it, can I? Excellent. How does it work? Yeah, I did that. Oh, okay. Thank you. So this is a graphic of a compact sort of 15-minute neighbourhood. I took it from the Government Policy Statement on Housing and Urban Development. So obviously they're neighbourhoods that enable residents to access most of their activities that they need for good living within a 15 to 20-minute walk, cycle or public transport trip from their home. And we're not suggesting that Kāpiti should indulge in 12-storey developments, but you get the idea. We already have embryonic examples of 15 to 20-minute neighbourhoods in this district. You look at Paikakariki or Otaki Town or Waikanai Beach. They have the embryo of a 15-minute neighbourhood within them. Oops, now what? Oh, there we go. So why higher density living? I know that you're looking at this anyway, but firstly it will reduce emissions, and that's really important for us. The 1.5 project that I mentioned there suggests that we need to aim for almost full decarbonisation of transport by 2030. If you're not familiar with them, I suggest you look them up. They're a New Zealand initiative with some really serious intellectual grunt. I'm sure I don't need to remind you that Kāpiti's transport emissions are significantly higher than the national average, and we must address them urgently. And then one of the other reasons for this, of course, is the government mandates, which you know about. Interestingly, the government uses the term urban system, which is worth thinking about, I think. The other reason really is responding to the housing crisis without sacrificing productive soils. So following on the previous image of a compact neighbourhood, I'd just like to talk briefly about space with regard to transport. Our high use of private cars in Kāpiti is not only a problem for us because of high emissions and negative health impacts, it also gobbles up enormous amounts of space, and those photos demonstrate that. As your draft strategy suggests, we must prevent further loss of our precious productive soils, and this is why our two groups urge you to drop any thought of growing out for the foreseeable future and focus on growing up. And this is another little graphic from our submission. It illustrates clearly how inefficient private car use is in terms of space in our neighbourhoods. Alongside the need to reduce emissions, this is why we must get away from car-centric planning. And it's not, I didn't find this particularly comprehensible at first, so just let me take you through it quickly. 1A is one pedestrian. That's the amount of space that one pedestrian takes up, so that's our unit. That same pedestrian using public transport still only takes up the same amount of space. When they become a cyclist, they take up 7 units of that space. So there's a certain amount of that is them and their cycle, and then there's the parking arrangements. When they get into a car, they take up 30 units of space. So 18 units for themselves in the car, and then additional units of space for parking. And if they have a private car park, then it zooms up to 90 units. So you can see that providing for private transport is hugely space consuming in our districts. So a 15-minute neighbourhood revolves around the idea that people walk, cycle or use public transport to get around, and in essence somewhere around 4 times less space is required for transport in a 15-minute neighbourhood. It's a no-brainer, especially if you team it up with the health and climate co-benefits. So, the concept of a neighbourhood structure is not alien to us here in Kāpiti, and I know from my experience of working with the local communities when I was contracting to KCDC that it's an aspect of living here that many residents value. You won't be surprised that both our groups are opposed to retaining the airport, just to move on to the collection of low-carbon neighbourhoods. Aside from the very obvious greenhouse gas emission issues from air travel, particularly the short-haul flights, you only need to read the report from Lockyer Airport Management, which indicates insuperable health and safety and emergency constraints on trying to keep it operating. The Council could facilitate a carefully planned demonstration of the desirability and benefits of medium density living, building on the Kāpiti concept of highly livable villages if that airport land were allocated for residential living. So, what are the benefits of 15-minute neighbourhoods for you, the Council? No matter where growth occurs, you're going to have to put infrastructure in. If you're planning for 30,000 additional people, or 14, or whatever it is, whatever number you use, the additional infrastructure costs are going to be incurred. So basing the growth on a 15-minute neighbourhood model will result in considerable savings in roading and car-related costs, which could be allocated elsewhere. If the existing Kāpiti model of the string of villages were used in communicating with the idea to the residents, we think it would be relatively easy to swing people in behind it. And my final slide, to convince you of the benefits of densification and developing the airport land from the council point of view. This is Auckland, but you get the drift. The colours is about value, taxable value or rateable value returning to the council and therefore the community. There's absolutely no way an airport could return as much value to the council and therefore the community as a well-planned medium density housing development on that land. So that was what I wanted to pick up out of our submission. Thank you for your attention.
Right, questions? Councillor Coates.
Kia ora to you both. I'll leave it up to you who answers this one. But one of the things that I've raised throughout the workshops and briefings we've had about developing this plan for consultation is the concern around the reliance on public transport. So certainly not doubting the purpose that it serves and the need for it. Agree with everything you've said. But as you're probably both aware, it's severely lacking out there. So it might be helpful from both your perspective how you see or the group sees that playing into this and their role in terms of coming to the table. We've done our bit in terms of the document and getting feedback from the community to hopefully develop a great document to inform that. What do you say? I mean, ultimately it's Greater Wellington, I think, more so than anyone else in their role. Yeah, and we totally recognise that it's difficult getting traction there for this council. Traditionally it has been. That doesn't mean to say that you give up. I think you just have to keep pushing, and we're planning to start pushing them as well independently. But there are models that are available. I think one of the problems with Greater Wellington is that they have this idea of a rail spine and then feeder bus routes that come around. Past my place in Waikanae East, a bus goes past, not past my place, but not close enough, once an hour. If I want to go down and visit my doctor at the beach, it takes me 2 hours. Yeah. It's not set up. It's just and that's why people hop in their cars. Of course they do. What else are they going to do? So the Timaru example, if you're not familiar with it, of public transport on demand, have a look at that. They ran a very successful pilot on it over the last year or so, and they've put it in place permanently because it was so successful. And it's a completely different model. So it's public transport, but it's on demand. As I understand it, you can wave it down or you can book it to come when you need it. Thanks, Alison. And I'm comforted to hear that you and the team behind you are looking at getting onto that topic, because I don't disagree with what you said. Absolutely agree. And my concern is that a lot of this revolves around that efficient, prompt, affordable public transport. We simply don't have it. But I agree with your point. That doesn't mean we shouldn't still strive towards those outcomes.
And just to add to that, the 15-minute neighbourhood thing is not just public transport. It's the cycling and walking in particular, and the co-benefits of that in terms of health and well-being and climate response are huge.
Councillor Compton.
Thank you very much for your presentation today. I just wanted to pick up on your final point in that final slide about the villages that we have and using that as the way to I guess, socialise the 15-minute neighbourhood concept. In your point of view, would you see that using the villages and using, I guess, Councillor Halliday always calls it the string of pearls, but using those as the sort of embryos of this idea in Kāpiti, that would strengthen the idea of those string of pearls and the unique identities rather than losing everything to endless sprawl? Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a sort of native Kāpiti idea already, the idea of small neighbourhoods that are that have links. But so it seems if you're clever in the way you position it and your messaging, then you can build on that to sell this kind of concept. It shouldn't. It would be more of a this is how we are, a distinctive Kāpiti cultural thing, and so because what people fear is loss. So, that would position it as less of a loss and more of just building on what we've got, it seems to me. Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, I love
Councillor Halborough.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I love the kaupapa around the 15-minute neighbourhoods. I just noticed in that picture that I don't know if it relies on that kind of very that high-rise construction, which isn't particularly environmentally friendly, with the imported steel and concrete, and do 15-minute neighbourhoods necessarily rely on that kind of intensity?
Well, no, that's a demonstration from Auckland, and it's an actual present representation. It's not a futuristic one. It's just what they get currently. But the concept is that the denser your habitation of the land, the more you can tax it, the more you can rate it, the more council gets from it. I was particularly pointing out the benefits to the council, and through the council, the community in terms of revenue, and therefore what you can spend money on. But nobody's suggesting that Kāpiti should go for high density living. I mean, it just wouldn't fly at this point. But medium density living, why not? I mean, I lived in France for some years in my 20s, and Paris is a really human scale city, but the buildings are mostly, the inner city buildings are mostly about 7 stories. It feels really human. It feels manageable. So it's not, 6 to 7 stories is not a problem really, it seems to me.
Another question, if I might. So I love this idea of on-demand public transport too. Have you suggested that to Greater Wellington at all?
No, but we're working on it.
Yeah, please do. Sounds ideal for us. And there was another one. Oh yes, the idea of measuring your environmental kind of standing in terms of the surrounding environmental qualities. Have we done any of that already, or are you looking at that?
Not to my...
Particularly with the retiring of the wetlands in Queenswood Park, it would be wonderful to do a before shot and an after shot, if you like.
Yes, not to my knowledge. I just recently came across this amazing researcher, but really, I guess it's the notion that what are we benchmarking our built environment against? And if we're interested in a holistic environment that supports life thriving, then let's look at what nature provides first and foremost, and we have great examples here, and then take that across into our design principles for our urban design.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you for your presentations. Thank you.
I think I did see last week a statement from Regional Council looking at small buses in public transport on demand. I think they're onto that. Councillor Hanford.
Yeah, kia ora koroa. I've got a couple of questions. The first one being, you talked about how growing up and not out would help to enable 15-minute neighbourhoods, but in terms of other things that you think council can be doing to kind of create the foundations or lay the groundwork for those neighbourhoods to be created, could you expand on that a little bit more too? For example, the different infrastructure that might be required for safe cycling and safe walking, because obviously we can provide the housing that would help to enable this, but if there aren't safe ways for people to get around to and from where they need to go. So that's my first question.
It's the concept is sometimes called the mini Holland concept, and George Weeks, who spoke to us at the Kāpiti Dialogue a while ago, worked in London on mini Hollanding. I think it was Walthamstow Forest. And there's some really interesting stuff online about that. You can see how they changed the high street, which had had about 50% occupancy in its shops, to 100% occupancy, because they turned the main street into a mixed use walking, cycling, and some through traffic, but not much. And so, that stuff is really critical, because the idea of a 15-minute neighbourhood is that it's where people want to be, it's where their life is. So it can't just be, a 4-lane road. It's got to be somewhere which is a human space. So, getting rid of cars and removing cars out of those environments as much as possible is going to be really critical.
Yeah, I've just got one other question. Thank you for that, Alison. We've heard from iwi through this korero, and it was really great to see through your submission that you support iwi aspirations too for growth and how they wish to see that manifest and how we grow. And something that we've heard quite a bit from them is that we need to learn to live with the land and with each other and not on the land. So I'm wondering too how you feel that 15-minute neighbourhoods as a concept will enable and allow us to live better with the land and with each other, kind of creating those communities, a more social element.
Yes, I'm happy to address that. Well, by its very nature, if our lifestyle becomes more pedestrian or able to get around on cycles and low-speed scooters and things like that, people are going to be more connected to the land first and foremost. But it's also about how to build and allow for that green space, whether that is on top of rooftops or in channels to separate perhaps motorised vehicles from cycling, from walkers. There's some beautiful images that George Week provided showing already existing neighbourhoods in Europe where the streets are beautiful and people want to be in them because they're full of trees and they're full of green space and there's room for everybody, but there's not a lot of room for high-speed, high-volume vehicle traffic because it's not designed, it's kind of designed it out. And I think that is really fundamental, particularly for those of us who are urban dwellers, to start to be able to reconnect with the land, reconnect with nature, and have it be part of everyday life, not something you jump in your SUV and go away at the weekend to experience, but it can be part of your everyday life. And during both lockdowns, I loved the experience of walking around my little neighbourhood in Ramadi South and not being imposed upon by vehicles, and just to be free to be with the environment that we're really privileged to have here. But it's having us have a built environment that supports us to engage with it rather than sort of pass by it all the time.
Councillor Bravanov.
Thank you. Through you, Mr Mayor. Thank you both, Rachel and Alison, coming along to talk today. Some really interesting points that you've talked about, and I suppose one of the things that struck me, and I suppose it relates probably to your analogy maybe in Paris, Alison, and I suppose I've lived in London, I know the same sort of thing here, but for some of these things to work, it's actually about economies of scale. And could you do you think that is correct? In terms of the population living in a small area to get it all to gel?
Yeah, but I mean that slide sort of in some ways says it all. The economies of scale are gained through medium density or some form of intensification. So and the thing about the 15-minute neighbourhoods is that it represents significant savings in some areas, which mean that then you do have more funds to allocate to other priorities, or simply to hold your rates rises down. and because we have the embryo of it in so many places in Kāpiti, it's not like you have to totally re-engineer a city. It's there really, and it's not, it shouldn't be as potentially as expensive to do as it would be in some places around the world where, you think of the States or something like that where there's just huge roads going everywhere.
Yeah, so I suppose part of what you're talking about is the infrastructure, but the other part of it too is how people actually use it. And I suppose what I'm saying here, do you think that to help make this work for that 15-minute time frame is for residents to be able to work locally within that 15 minutes, and how can we achieve that?
Well, this district already has a high proportion of its residents who work independently from home. I can't remember what the statistics are, but it's higher than the normal, the average, the national average. So we've already got a lot of people who work where they live. We have a chunk of people who go into town, into Wellington, of course, but there's an embryo of that. And with COVID, more people are working from home, and everybody's saying that that's likely to continue, even if it's not every day, it's some days, and so that gives you more people working locally, which the multiplier effect of that on the economy is quite significant. If people go into town to work, they earn their salary in town, they spend a chunk of it in town as well. If they're working here, they spend most of it here, and so and people like working in nice neighbourhoods. There's all sorts of creative things you could do around work hubs, and there's solutions all over the internet really for that sort of thing.
So the other thing I wanted to just talk about was, I certainly like being in an environment that's got a lot of nature, even though you're actually close in the middle of something. But I went to a presentation in Wellington where they were talking about this, but they were saying that really less than 50% of people are really interested in nature. So how, for those balanced communities, how are you actually going to get, possibly the vast majority of the population to be engaged in this type of concept? It's more than a concept, but basically the reality of this.
Well, I'd like to suggest most of us live here because of the connection with nature. Otherwise, economics aside, many of us would probably live in Wellington if we didn't care about the environment that much. But people move out here for the lifestyle, don't they?
Sometimes it's price as well.
Well, but that argument aside, but it's often, and it's what we say is beautiful about Kāpiti I agree. So I think you would have a stronger base of people who would support that, and I don't think that would be the only co-benefit that you would promote to people. Just the convenience of being able to pop round the corner and get most of your needs met in your local little shopping area and not have to go clear across the coast to get your toilet paper or whatever is your priority, would surely be of interest to people, and that they could have their whole life, so their children schooling, being able to get to school easily without that huge run in the mornings of dropping kids off and picking them up in the afternoons. If we could engineer that more effectively so that people are able to walk or cycle or get their family around more easily in those small neighbourhoods, that would add to the value of people's living, right?
Thank you.
Councillor McCann.
Just on that, you've mentioned the environment. Some people, but the only way to have a walkable community that can actually house everyone really is intensification. And we've heard from a number of groups that they're quite like intensification except where they live. What's your thoughts about that? And then as the second part of that, many people see that connection to the environment as being able to have a backyard or space, but intensification can limit some of those opportunities. How do you see that being mitigated against with new design principles?
Yep. Well, two things. I think intensification is coming whether people like it or not, because central government has opened up Pandora's box with that anyway. And I guess the decision that this district needs to make is, do you want it in a planned fashion, or do you want it in a higgledy-piggledy, whatever a developer feels like doing fashion, where you have limited control over what you end up with in terms of your neighbourhoods? You know, I guess that I'm playing a devil's advocate here, but that's, with no plan, people will do what's most economic as a development generally, and it's short term, and there's very little consideration for how do you incorporate more of those natural aspects that were spoken about today. How do you incorporate the workability and the walkability of neighbourhoods, rather than just, you know, let it run on a purely short-term commercial basis, and you kind of get what you deserve when you do that, right? So that's kind of my argument. It's better to plan and try to guide the process than just to open it up to whoever can do it most cheaply.
And just to follow up before we get to the second question, would you say that the document that we've put together, Growing Well, attempts to do that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the key thing is going to be leadership. You know, at some point, the council has to make a decision about whether it's going to just roll over and put its paws in the air and let the community do, you know, and the developers in particular do whatever they want, which will be short-term, low-cost, whatever, or high-term, high-cost, high-end stuff that is unaffordable. Or are you going to, you know, show some leadership and guidance? And I mean, the government has strengthened your hand with its mandates around densification. You know, the opportunity is there for the picking. And, you know, I mean, you could have the sort of thing. I mean, one of the things about living in Paris was that the inner city with its 7-storey limit is lovely, but you get out into the suburbs, which were, you know, developed in the 60s and 70s, and it's hideous because it's those massive tower blocks. So, you know, there has to be some regulation of it. You've got a real opportunity here, and you're talking about 6-storey developments around the train stations, etc. That makes sense to me. That, you know, that looks like a sensible thing to do, but that can be incorporated into a 15-minute concept quite readily, I think.
Right. No other questions. Thank you very much for taking the time, Rachel and Alison.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think next is Sam Pritchard, I think 4:45. Oh, yeah. Is that Mandy? There's juice left. Mandy, just a moment while we get started. Oh my God.
Just ancillary to Paul Turner's presentation.
Oh, cool. Is that the one?
From his company, it's done by somebody else in his company, but it sort of sits to that first part of this presentation.
Is that the overhead that he had?
Yeah.
Okay. Mandy?
We don't need a break, do we?
No.
No.
Are you bugging off? You can't. Are you bunking off? Oh, okay.
Oh, good. Know that one. Thank you.
So we don't have this final opportunity. So he's there, and I think we've got come in. Yeah. Next Tuesday. Is it a long one? No, we don't have it. Next year I've got a full day. We've got a couple of hours.
Yeah, 2 hours.
But the intention is to provide a high level summary of some of the things we've heard and then discuss some of them. Yeah.
Okay. That's fine, thank you. Kia ora, I'm Mandy Savage from the Cancer Society. Thank you for the opportunity to come here and speak today and to get in early. KCDC has the responsibility for outdoor spaces, recreation areas, sports facilities, including an outdoor swimming pool in Waikanai, outdoor workers, community events, and the granting and planning of building approvals, thereby shaping the social and environmental environment and physical environment in which we live. KCDC is in a unique position to ensure that some protection options are provided in shared outdoor public spaces, particularly in respect to shade. Thus, we would encourage KCDC to consider providing the following 2 items, or considering them in the Growing Well strategy for our community. 1, provision of shade. Shade is one of the most effective ways to achieve protection against overexposure to ultraviolet radiation. The construction costs can be a one-off expense, but unfortunately in new developments, shade is sometimes either treated as an afterthought or as the first element to be chopped in budget cuts. The Kāpiti environment creates unique challenges for shade design. Our climate can be windy, changeable and temperate. Thus, warm shade is required and achieved by using materials, for example, polycarbonate, that block the transmission of UVR, but not the heat and visible light. Well-located covered spaces can have multiple functions. For example, in housing, a north-facing veranda can provide summer shade as well as a dry outdoor space. Good quality shade can reduce UVR exposure by up to 75% when used in combination with other protective measures such as your sun protective clothing, hats, sunglasses and sunscreen. Shade is actually the best way to provide maximum protection. The Local Government Act highlights the need for a healthy and safe environment and designing for a place that will enhance our well-being and make it a more attractive place to live. A 2013 survey found that 78% of New Zealand adults either strongly agreed or somewhat agreed that their council should use money from rates to provide shade in public spaces. The Cancer Society recommends focusing on areas used by families and children, particularly those in our lower socioeconomic status communities. Natural shade should be a major element of shade planning in an outdoor play space or new subdivisions or housing areas. Trees with dense foliage and wide-spreading canopies close to the ground provide shade for open spaces and are aesthetically appealing in terms of landscape design. Natural shade is well suited for large recreational areas close to beaches as well as our parks and reserves, with less reflection from natural surfaces. Careful attention to climate and extreme weather conditions, e.g. wind, is needed when choosing our trees. Also, in subdivisions, there need to be consideration when planting near footpaths and pipes. Is that it? Okay. So in terms of built shade, there needs to be more appropriately designed structural shade where we work, live and play. Our permanent shade structures, whether standalone or attached to existing buildings, will all provide a predictable shadow from UV, heat, wind and rain. It's recommended that professional building advice be sought from a shade installer, a builder, a landscape or an architect to ensure safety and purpose. Well-designed shade will make the outdoor space comfortable for use in all seasons, and appropriate shade will control temperature in warmer areas and allow heat transmission in light and cooler areas. Built shade can extend the life of our play equipment beyond the summer months and provide shelter from the rain. It can enhance the aesthetic appeal of neighbourhoods and subdivisions, be environmentally friendly and provide protection for generations to come. And the second area of my submission is outdoor workers and contractors. As our community grows, more and more housing is built and there will be more and more outdoor workers in our region. Outdoor workers have a significantly increased risk of some types of skin cancer. It's important that KCDC provide policy and practical support for sun protection. Under the Health and Safety and Environment Act, where there is risk to health and safety from sun exposure during work, KCDC must ensure that risk is managed appropriately for both their own outdoor workers that they employ and subcontractors. Skin cancer is the most common cancer in Aotearoa, and along with Australia, we have the highest rate of melanoma skin cancer in the world. The total cost for treating skin cancers is estimated to be $180 million annually, which is around 20% of the total cost of treating cancers. Our Kāpiti Coast DHB stats for Kāpiti show that there have been 2,192 melanomas over the last 20 years. Over 90% of skin cancers are caused by overexposure, and with good protection against UVR, almost all skin cancer cases can be prevented. Research shows that if shade is available in our communities, people will use it. The Cancer Society can help support KCDC to prioritise both shade and community wellbeing. Together we can reduce the rates of skin cancer in our communities. Thank you. Questions?
I was really intrigued that there is such a profession as shade installers. People who install shade.
Yes.
Cool, eh? That's fun.
Cool that it's a job, yeah.
You have any questions? Interesting submission? No.
Actually, I have a question.
Councillor Bravanov.
So thank you very much, Mandy, for coming along to speak to us on this matter. So do you know of any towns or cities that actually provide good shade?
There would be examples across the country, and we actually fund a social and behavioural research unit down at Otago. I could probably find some exemplars for you and forward them to you. Off the top of my head, I can't say, for example, Tauranga does it well, or Invercargill or Dunedin does it badly. I would have to get that research for you, but I'm sure we can find something. Yes,
that would be great. And I suppose even little developments that have been done that do it well as well, rather than
in terms of subdivisions that do it well. I can just speak anecdotally and locally. If you go into Ferndale, for example,
okay.
I mean that shade for that community is fantastic.
Okay.
I can think of a subdivision that I wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable naming locally down off Mazengarb Road. I don't know if I really need to name it, but there's absolutely zero shade. And I can understand from a developer's perspective, it's extra money. There's the whole thing about, for our council workers as well, it's an extra cost maintaining good shade, maintaining good trees. You don't want them to knock apart your footpaths. You've got to think about your infrastructure and your piping. There are certain trees, certain varieties and species that you would use and some that you would avoid. But to me, there's no excuse for putting nothing in. Your communities should have something, and it should be part of the consideration when our developers put in their subdivisions.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mandy, I thought it was a really interesting submission. Yeah.
Thank you for taking me early. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. Sam Pritchard. Tēnā koe, Sam.
take masks off. Yeah. Yeah. Kia ora.
Welcome.
Thank you. Are we good to go, are we?
Yep.
So kia ora, I'm Sam Pritchard. I'm a Director of Land Matters in Pritchard Civil, both companies based here in Kāpiti. We've got projects from Dargaville to Dunedin at the moment, but predominantly working in Porirua, Kāpiti and Horowhenua. But today I'm here to speak in a personal capacity and for Kāpiti as a district and as a place that my 4 kids are growing up in. I think this document's very critical to the growth that we're going to see in the next 30 years. And especially the next 10 years, it's going to be really transformational for our region. So I think we've got one chance to get it right, and it needs to be done properly. It needs to be aspirational, it needs to be market-driven, and I think it needs to be really well considered. I've sort of come along today to say I welcome the opportunity to be involved in the further input and feedback as we progress the plans through the implementation and delivery phase. And I'm just keeping it really high level and brief today. I know it's the end of the day, but that's all I've got to say.
Right, question time. Councillor McCann has got his very long question.
Controversial. So you said market-driven. Isn't actually one of the big problems that we have with the housing crisis is that it's been market-driven?
I think we had this discussion last time, didn't we?
Yeah, we'll have it again because you raised it.
No, I don't believe so. I think you've got to cover for both ends of the spectrum, and I think we just need better opportunity to do really good development that provides for lower cost housing. I'm working for a community housing provider in Auckland, and it's really difficult to find that. They've got hotels everywhere, and they've tasked us with finding them housing in blocks of 10, and it's really difficult to do. And so if we can help do that, you've got that end of the continuum, and then you've got the people buying $4 million houses down at Ramadi Beach. So that's I think the problem. You can't do that is funding.
Yeah, so I mean, we all agree that the 4 million, the higher end of the market is working reasonably well. It's the other end where the market effectively prices out social housing, really affordable housing. That's where I'm wondering why you use the market-driven works, because clearly you're coming up against it, trying to find them an opportunity because the market has priced you out. So what needs to change in order to be able to support that end of the housing continuum?
I think it's the funding model. I think it's the iwi we're working for have got funding, but in Kāpiti here, it's just looking at different ownership models. The rent to buy, I know council are looking at that kind of stuff now. What else is there? Shared equity. I think they bring, and then getting funding from banks. You've got to come up with this deposit, 20% deposit. And what's your average house now in Kāpiti?
910,000, we heard. Yeah.
Yep. So what's a 20% deposit? It's 180,000. So that's a huge whack to come up with. And if someone could, if you do the rent to buy, someone else comes up with a deposit and then you pay that deposit back over time.
And thank you, it's very good. And I would note none of those are market driven. They're all interventions. So, point to Rob.
Right. Any other questions? Councillor Coates.
G'day Sam, good to see you. Look, I note from the others that we've heard from today and through the submissions that we've had Landlink in today and a couple of others, just I can't remember, long day, but all with a willingness to work with council on these developments. And I know from talking with yourself that same desire exists here. What do you think can be achieved through us working more collaboratively together with developers, with companies like yourself, and what has the process been to date since going on this journey around growing well?
I'll have to give credit to Jason and Hamish and, sorry, what's your name in the middle? Richard, was it? Chris. They've been pretty good getting around talking to everyone. And I guess probably part of my market-driven sentiment is, you get stuck in a bureaucracy, and I know offers are good, but are they doing, development stuff out there and getting that market feedback where the best areas are to develop? And that's probably where, and it's hard because obviously we're a number of hats, and ideally I'm looking out for myself and my family and our businesses. So you want to see, but in saying that, I want to see the whole region grow and be sustainable as it grows. So it's continuing that discussion. It's been a pretty quick process with getting the documents out, and it's probably a credit to these guys doing it quickly. But that meant I haven't been through every little bit of detail, and that's probably the next phase.
Yeah, and I guess that's the key point, is that there's an opportunity for an ongoing discussion with the likes of yourselves, with the Paul Turners and so forth around, sure, we do this and we come out with some decisions at the end of it, but there's still an opportunity to work together around the implementation of that.
Yep.
Cool.
Sam, the increasing requirement legally to engage with EV, given your company's long existence and experience, have you got any advice to give on how council can facilitate better in that area?
How we can do it better?
Yeah.
It just needs to be collaborative, and if everyone's on the same page, and it is a little bit harder here that our iwi haven't been through the settlement process, because having those funds and a bit of expertise behind them makes the job a lot easier. So working for it's Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei in Auckland, they've got, I'm working for the Runanga, so different to the Ōrākei in the Viaduct, but they've got all sorts of funding to pay for consultants and the right people to be in their team. And if the iwi here have that now, they can make the most of the opportunities. And that's working with, there's so much, there's land and funding available from whether it's housing and urban development, Kaingaora, Te Puna Kaukuri, there's a lot of opportunity out there. And we're trying to work with the Otaki Pororo Trust Board and utilising their land holdings in Otaki, because there's a huge opportunity up there. And that's going to be, and Otaki is a pretty, special place in my heart. It needs to make the most of those opportunities in that land for employment and housing, because we're going to lose the heart of that community if house prices keep going up and people have to move north.
Very good. Councillor Halliday.
Yeah, hi Sam. Your points 5 and 6 in your submission, you talked to Greenfield should be expanded instead of going up to 6. And height limits need further thoughts and consultations. Just wanted to know your comments around that.
Again, I'm a little bit biased. Grew up on a farm in Otaki, and I think people come to Kāpiti for the balanced lifestyle and bigger sections, and sections are getting smaller, and now we're going up. I don't see people coming here for a 12 metre apartment block in Waikanai at the station or in Palapurumu. But I think that will come over time, and given we are talking about a 30-year period, maybe that will come. But I'm a bit biased. It's not my cup of tea. And again, it comes back to Rob's point. It's a price point, and you can see the townhouse terrace housing that's happening. It's a price point. They're going really well.
Councillor,
can I just tease it out a little bit further with you, Sam, and totally understanding your background, where you come from, very similar. Myself, and you've got an idea of where I live now. Around town centres, around transport nodes, railway stations, do you share that same view around places like that in terms of, and maybe, I think the fear is everyone jumps to high intensity 6 stories and, the absolute, worst case scenario. But do you, thinking of your comments you've just made to Councillor Halliday, are you supportive of it around those town centre transport nodes, or still not?
I am, but it just has to be done really well. I think we've got to be really careful they don't become the slums of the future. And that comes back to amenity, transport linkages, green space.
Right, Sam. No more questions. Thank you for taking the time talking to us.
No worries. Thank you.
Cheers. Monique, Chamber of Commerce. She's zooming. Gee, I didn't know my bald head was shining so much. See, Jason will agree.
Dominique. Teresa, are you captioning for Monique?
That's correct, thank you. Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Monique, you there?
Can't see her there.
Yep.
She was in and has just left again, so we'll just try and get in contact with her.
I'll send her a message.
Okay, awesome.
In the meantime, shall we just get Anna?
Is Anna? Oh.
Anna, do you want to start?
Sure.
I thought you'd gone to Australia.
No, I didn't like the high rises. Thanks. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep. O tēnā koutou, ko ana kata ahau. You've just heard from Sam Pritchard from Land Matters, and earlier today you heard from Bryce Holmes, also from Land Matters. And I guess the reason why all three of us have come down today is because this document's really important. And I hope you don't mind, I'm going to take this down because it's actually quite hard to talk. It's a really important document, and you know, I think it's Council's response to the National Policy Statement on Urban Development and the requirement that Tier 1 councils that KCDC is a part of has to give effect to the housing need in the short, medium and long term on the Kāpiti Coast. And from what I can see reading the Housing and Business Capacity Assessment Report, we're looking at needing to have between 6,000 and 8,000 dwellings in the next 30 years. And of those, you know, 84% are probably going to be standalone dwellings, and about 12% will make up terrace housing and apartments. And I guess what's really important about this process is that the National Policy Statement on Urban Development requires that Kāpiti Coast District Council must give effect to this demand, to address this demand for housing immediately. And so it basically takes you outside the Schedule 1 process. So there isn't the same interrogation of the background, the assumptions that have been made that underline, you know, say for example the BOFA reports and the Foresight report. And so I think this process is just critical, particularly getting those assumptions and those values right, because you're going to bypass that Schedule 1 process potentially to give effect to these provisions. And one of the things, you know, that I've looked at are the value sets that have been included, the draft principles for growth, and we really support those principles, but we have concerns around that principle developing city thinking. And the question really has to be for us is, what kind of city are we talking about? Now, the National Policy Statement for Urban Development requires Tier 1 councils to provide maximum housing capacity for city centres, but up to 6 stories for metropolitan centres. And my question really is, you know, what are we? Are we going to be a city centre or are we going to be a metropolitan centre? A metropolitan centre these terms are defined. They're defined in the National Planning Standards. And a metropolitan centre is an area used for a broad range of commercial, community, recreational and residential activities. And it's a zone that is a focal point for sub-regional urban catchments. A city centre zone, on the other hand, is a main centre for a district or a region. And the way that I think the BOFA report is tracking is looking at creating a city centre with 15 stories in the city centre. And I don't think that's what we want to have in Kāpiti. I think we're a metropolitan centre, and I think the obligations, therefore, under the National Policy Statement for Urban Development is for a metropolitan centre for up to 6 stories high. That then kind of leads me into thinking about, well, you know, if we're not going to put the majority of our new housing demands into that
into that highly intensified city centre, where are we going to go? And, you know, I'm supportive of the approach that's been taken, which is upwards and outwards, but I think that we can do more growth in some more greenfield areas. And that kind of reflects some of the discussion that's come out of the HBA report too, that considered that 45% of our growth should happen in greenfield areas. And one of the benefits of that is that growth in greenfield areas is really resilient. We can design new development to, one, be as carbon neutral as possible, but also, two, we can design it to be resilient to climate change and to increased storm events and to increased flood risk. So please don't dismiss greenfield development as not being carbon neutral or not being resilient going forward into the future, because I think you need to really balance that with, you know, our overall objectives for Kāpiti. What do we want to be? And I've put in there an image from Wanganui. Is that my time?
That's all right, keep going.
So I've put in there an image from Wanganui. I've done a bit of work up in Wanganui recently, and I just think it's a really beautiful city. I think it's a city that we should model ourselves on, to be honest. And I think about it like a European city, 4 to 6 stories high. It's of a human scale. And, you know, I think when that's coupled with appropriate greenfield growth, intensification that's going to come out of this enabling housing legislation that's just been announced, then we're going to meet our targets. And actually on that note, I do also think that, you know, the HBA report, which I assume is going to be up for review, or is in the process of being reviewed actually, hopefully will sort of come out or align itself with the recommendations coming out of the government on the enabling housing legislation, which you will recall is where government's looking at having 3 dwellings on every residential zoned allotment. So that's going to significantly change, you know, the housing demand. If that goes through in that current format, which, to be honest, it's likely to, given that both National and Labor support it, then we're going to see a totally different look in Kāpiti. So I guess my last point is around density and the type of density that has been adopted by Foresight in their report. And I've attached a document done by Becca for Wellington City. It's the last page of my submission. So this is what Wellington City have adopted for their spatial plan. And pretty much it's identical to the densities that have been adopted by Foresight. But their central city densities are 115 dwellings per hectare and Foresight's is 100 dwellings per hectare. And I think we don't want to be in that high density, that high density framework. We want to be in that medium to high density framework for our centres or centre, and we want to stay away from that really high density, 15 stories, 12 stories plus, because we're going to end up looking like friggin' the Sunshine Coast or the Gold Coast, and that's going to devastate the Kāpiti Coast community, the beautiful amenity that we have. And that's not to say that I don't support intensification, because I'm fully supportive of it. And I think for too long we haven't done enough in our district plan to achieve it. So I think that's me. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Anna, I'm finding it difficult to understand city thinking. I mean, I know that that's a psychological behavioral issue. We are talking about actual buildings. Buildings can create that type of thinking, or can people live in small towns and think they're living in a city? What's city thinking?
Well, that's really my question to you too, and to the councillors, because I think it can be anything. It can be anything, but the way that this proposal has put forward is it's actually a high density. It's not a metropolitan city, it's a city centre. That's the way. So it's okay to have city thinking, but the city thinking that I think we should be supporting is a metropolitan centre, a sub-regional centre city, not not the CBD that we see in Wellington, not the stuff we see over on the Sunshine Coast or the Gold Coast, or, you know, that to me is not... Wanganui is a city, and that's a metropolitan city, and it's a beautiful city. So my concern is that we need to align that kind of city thinking with the outcomes that we've got to seek, and it's really important that we get that right. And I think that the part of getting that right will come from knowing really clearly about the figures coming out of the new HBA report, and hopefully that HBA report will align itself with the decision that's made on the enabling housing legislation.
Cool. Councillor Coates.
Hi, Anna. Nice to see you again, and that we managed to retain you in New Zealand and not to Australia. I heard that news from Sam, and I thought he'd be pretty pleased. Just following on from Mayor Guru's comment, if I understood you, your talk to us, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, your question to us around the metropolitan or the city is based on, I guess, either our interpretation or our reading of the government policy statement. And I think you're saying we've chosen to kind of verbalise ourselves as a city, and what you're saying is you see us more as a metropolitan. We should have chosen that option in terms of metropolitan. Is that right? Is that what you've said, or have I got it wrong?
I think that the framework is okay, the principles for growth are okay, but it's not. But the way that it's tracking through the recommendations in the report for a city centre type city as opposed to a metropolitan type city. So I think it's up to us as a community to decide what kind of city we want to be. I'm saying I think we should be more aligned to a metropolitan centre, and that therefore the response to that should not be 12 stories in Palapurumu. I'm saying 4 to 6 stories in Palapurumu, Waikanae and Otaki.
Cool. And I certainly heard that coming through. I was just trying to see whether that was pinned back to the government's policy. But look, I think you've made that really clear.
Yeah, if you look, and I can direct James to policy 3 in the MPSUD. So it talks about how a Tier 1 council has to respond to the MPSUD. And it says in city centre zones that you have to maximise development capacity as much as possible. But in metropolitan centre zones, and you guys can choose where those are,
that's my point.
Building heights and densities are to reflect demand for housing, in all cases building heights of at least 6 stories. And then there's kind of filters down to walkable catchments, where within walkable catchments you should also be providing building heights of up to 6 stories.
Yeah.
So that's the underlying legislation that's driving these spatial strategies that are coming out.
Cool, that's helpful.
Councillor McCann.
Hi. I'm not against the development in greenfields. I just noticed there's a very strong push from your group for promoting greenfields. And there was something that you said that caught my attention, which was it felt like you were saying that greenfields could be somewhat neutral to the environment. But if you're taking out a whole bunch of trees and putting in buildings, do you have an opportunity to end up creating a neutral outcome? I know that we can do things much better than we have done in the past, but...
So if you look at the Wellington growth framework, they talk about, and then also the HBA report, the Housing Business Capacity Assessment. Both of those reports talk about greenfield contributing to meeting this housing demand in all of the regions in Wellington, right? So it's not that greenfield's not going to happen, it's where we put it and identifying the best possible place for greenfield, because it's part of the mix of intensification, infill and greenfield. And I'm supportive of both. I'm supportive across the board of all of those things, so intensification, infill and greenfield. What the Wellington Growth Framework has said is that greenfield can be more resilient to climate change, because obviously, you're working from today's bottom line. So all of our work in a greenfield development is based on the information that we know on climate change, and we have on geotech and liquefaction and static and vertical stability and stuff like that. I think the question around green corridors are important, and that should definitely form part of any kind of district plan where we're incorporating greenfield areas. So we should absolutely have green corridors, but that's happening now. Green corridors are part and parcel of a lot of greenfield developments.
Not sure I quite got the answer I was looking for, but thank you.
People sometimes disagree, you know. Right, any other question? Martin Holiday.
Hi, look, just talking about green corridors there. Are you perhaps referring to the old state highway corridor potentially being a green corridor running through the district as such?
Well, that would be an example of one, and it's really interesting because green corridors are becoming, more important for a lot of urbanised areas because they don't have green corridors. So cities across the world are now looking at how they can incorporate green corridors into their sites, into their existing urban areas. But you can provide for green corridors in a whole lot of ways. You can provide for it through your water-sensitive urban design, for instance, with rain gardens and constructed wetlands, which is what we're doing now for greenfield development. But also it should be equally important in intensification of urban areas. So, yeah, and also that's the other thing with this enabling housing legislation, which is of great concern to a lot of people, is that that's potentially going to end up with 3 dwellings on a site. And, unless we have really good protections in place for our urban trees, we're going to see a lot of those go. So I think providing sufficient growth in our centres and then greenfield will hopefully protect a lot of that kind of unplanned, like say less comprehensive residential development stuff that could occur under that enabling housing legislation.
Right. No other questions. So thank you, Anna, for taking the time to speak to us.
Thanks for listening to me. Appreciate it.
Right. Is Monique ready? Monique, you there?
Just a wee bit squeaky, Monique. Oh.
Oh no, let me just adjust my volume.
Yep, that's great. That's great.
Okay, you're on.
Okay, kia ora koutou everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Monique Lex, and I'm Heather Hutchins. We are co-chair of the Kāpiti Coast Chamber of Commerce. You will have a submission in front of you, or access to it. They have 2 key themes running through a submission. And they are 1, the need for business attraction, and 2, the fact that the devil is in the detail, and a plan with genuine intent only is not enough. The how needs to be worked through in more detail. So Heather and I will be speaking to those 2 points today, with Heather starting us off.
Thank you, Monique. So, while the growth strategy mentions a population demographic, it does not mention the business demographic. Kāpiti's economy is made up largely of micro businesses. This is both a challenge and an opportunity. Kāpiti businesses are looking for a strong implementation plan to fall out of this strategy. It appears that business is not part of KCDC's growth principles. The growth strategy refers to partnerships with iwi, but what about partnership with business? What is the strategy and implementation to move this forward? Community is business and a business is community. Small business, given the chance, has every opportunity to become large business, which delivers increased employment and wealth to the community. The growth strategy talks about embracing the opportunity for growth, mentions city thinking, but nothing about business attraction fitting in to this city thinking. It mentions creating jobs, but without business, who is going to have the jobs for our people? The growth strategy has not given enough attention to business development. Business is not just retail and commercial office space. There has been no thought being given to business hubs, e.g. innovation hubs, creative hubs, clusters of particular industries. I was one of many at the Sustainable Foods Limited presentation last evening. This was exciting and forward-thinking and shows what can be done when business founders are supported and shown what Kāpiti has to offer. What is the proactive approach from KCDC to seek out opportunities to attract business here? Not just cross fingers and hope business will come. The attraction of expanding and relocating businesses helps to diversify the income base, most notably through the attraction of traded industries that produce goods and services locally and bring in new dollars outside the local or regional economy. A business implementation plan can better prepare economic development staff to identify and approach businesses that are most compatible with the community's goals and resources. And furthermore, with higher residential densities being encouraged, creating connected neighbourhoods is essential to growing well. The importance of fostering town centres cannot be underestimated. Each centre needs a heart and a pulse, and it needs to be a priority of the strategy to attract business into these town centres. Thank you.
Can't hear you. Monique, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Let me try again. Moving now into the second frame. Okay. Moving now into the second frame, which is around the devil being in the detail and the how needing to be worked through more thoroughly. On the growing wild matter, protection of spaces for retail and commercial offices does not go far enough to achieve business growth. Currently, you cannot construct a new commercial or industrial building within these zones in Kāpiti as a permitted activity under the district plan. This adds layers of cost and complexity and delays which are seen as unattractive by business and developers who could more readily invest elsewhere. Therefore, more thought needs to be given to the how to ensure these priorities and approaches are identified to achieve growing well. In addition, transport, like Heather touched on, is a critical element of business growth. In order for town centres to thrive, people need to be able to move around with ease to the different locations. It is easy to pass this off as a regional council function, but by doing so we will miss the opportunities otherwise afforded by taking the lead in this space. In this ever-evolving world of public transport, public transport such as buses may not be the only answer to moving people around easily. In terms of growing up and intensification, the current proposed RMA restrictions for Tier 1 councils provides mandatory guidance on densities for residential areas, and the strategy needs to be updated to align with this, or it will quickly become obsolete. The strategy will only meet government requirements if it is updated to give effect to this mandate. Specifically, the introduction of medium density residential standards by the National Policy Statement for Urban Development, which are tracking to come into force in August next year. With regards to growing out and the greenfield growth, we agree with Council's strategy on this matter. However, progress in freeing up this land for development is far too slow. The high priority future urban areas were identified in the district plan a decade ago and are only just going through the implementation phase now. These areas have already been partially developed ahead of these structure plans being formulated, as Council has been too slow in its implementation. In addition, development of these areas requires significant investment in infrastructure in order to realise an urban development potential. For this reason, some of the greenfield growth areas could be prioritised differently, as infrastructure is largely in place in Otahanga, but not in Wakana North. There have been missed opportunities for Council to provide infrastructure to some of these areas, i.e. through the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund, due to being too slow off the mark. The timing to free up medium priority greenfield growth areas needs to be brought forward to catch up on this reactive growth planning. Overall, what we are hearing from our membership is that when it comes to strategic planning and growth planning, the details matter. A close eye needs to be kept on district plan changes, which are for the purpose of implementing growth objectives. Previous attempts to allow some sort of development have been hamstrung by layers of rules, which makes the process unnecessarily costly and complex. For example, the need for a resource consent for what is a small volume of earthworks on residential sections. Retail activity not being a permitted activity in commercial zones due to parking or traffic or earthworks or other overlays. Central government released directions to remove car parking standards from all district plans across the country in order to help free up land for development. However, Kāpiti will likely be one of the last to implement and or will still look for ways to retain the car parking standards. The expectation in the community is for a similar slow-paced, reluctant approach to rolling out the new urban development directive. This implementation plan should direct council to be early adopters of growth-enabling legislation, and this intent needs to be carried right down through this strategy to the shop floor of council and those staff dealing face-to-face with business, investors and developers. Thank you. We welcome all your questions.
Right, question time. Councillor Coates.
Hi to you both. Good to see you, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. Similar question to what I asked a previous submitter around I guess what you'd refer to as the omission of business out of the Growing Well plan. Where do you see our economic development strategy, which has the priorities and implementations in there around economic development and I would say, or I'd argue, also business and business attraction? Where do you see that fitting into this? Because a lot of the comments have been made around the Growing Well strategy, almost as if it's ignoring our long-term plan, our ED strategy, and all those other guiding documents that we have in the background.
So what was the question?
There's been comments from both yourself and other submitters around the omission or the lack of focus around either economic development or business through the Growing Well document. Where do you see the economic development strategy that we've worked with the likes of the Chamber and others over the last couple of years that's now been adopted and being implemented? You know, I would, I guess, think or argue that that is where the things that you're pointing to are actually referred to, and the implementation in terms of that, in terms of things like business attraction, and maybe the missing part here is around the disconnect between the two documents.
Councillor Coates, I think that's where it is. There seems to be a disconnect between the two documents. It's like we've got and having been very heavily involved in that economic development strategy, somehow it doesn't cross over to this strategy. I think there is a disconnect. We need to get our heads around that.
That's right, but I say it's supposed to say a residential growth strategy, and it should be named accordingly. And it should just be linked back to the economic development strategy, if that's what it's meant to be. But if it's meant to be this cohesive, comprehensive growth strategy that looks at business and commercial and residential and open spaces and whatnot, then economic development and business growth and retention and the things that we've just been talking about need to be given attention just as much so as residential growth.
Right, any other questions? No? Well, thank you to both of you for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That brings us to a tidy end. And thank you to all those who had the stamina to stay behind. Well done. And thank you to the staff.